There are very few people I've told about the hidden suburb. All have dismissed my experience as a dream or an especially fantastical narrative endeavor, but the scar it's left on me, both literally and figuratively, has never faded. My therapist has been telling me that I need to let this go, to move on. And since I used to be an artist, I've come to a resolution. Here, people are more receptive to the abnormal, the unexplained, and the fucked up. I get this off my chest, and you all get a story. Fair trade, all things considered, and maybe by the end of this, I'll be able to finally move on. The year was 2009, and I was a 21-year-old art school dropout who had just moved back into his parents' home. To say I was feeling low was an understatement, so I tried to throw myself back into my art in the weeks since. But I wasn't finishing any pieces, and inspiration continued to evade me. So I did what I always did when I was at a loss. I went on a walk. I lived in a little gated community surrounded by hills and valleys. The tallest peak in the area was this cliff face that overlooked my street and could be reached through a relatively short hike through a forested trail. I was trudging through that trail one cool autumn night when I first saw it. When I was just about to summit the cliff, I caught the glow of lights around the bend of the cliff directly behind it. As long as I had known that side of the cliff was a valley shrouded in wilderness and difficult to reach. I tried angling myself for a better look, but could only get glimpses of what seemed to be a stone wall cascading harsh light outwards. This valley was at a higher elevation than the flatland my neighborhood resided in, and was tucked away behind the cliff, making it impossible to see at any vantage other than atop the cliff. So I rushed up to get a look, and sure enough, it was there. A housing development, the cheap kind, quickly built and cookie-cutter in their aesthetic. Some indescribable dread rose within me, as if I was gazing at something that shouldn't be seen. The streets radiated out from the center and were enclosed in a circular wall, creating this strange division of streets, and as far as I could tell, there were no cars. But the strangest part was the remoteness of it. There were no roads that led to the neighborhood, and none led out. It was completely out of place. It was as if someone had cut it from a regular suburb and placed it in the middle of the woods. I observed the neighborhood for a few minutes and saw no signs of life, and all the while the pervasive wrong of it worked to eventually drive me away. I asked a neighbor the following day if they knew when the suburb in the valley had been built, but all I got was a shrug, and there hasn't been any development here in years. My parents were on vacation for the fall, and I didn't think it mattered enough for me to phone them and ask. I tried forgetting it and moving on, but any artist knows the restlessness of unproductivity. The next time I saw the suburb was late into the night, maybe 3 a.m. I was wandering around in a near pitch-black forest trail, the cracked tarmac underneath my feet and the occasional beam of moonlight my only guide. I came to where the trail forked, one path leading up the hill and the other looping around the forest and back into itself, never once nearing the other side of the cliff. Too tired for the incline, I took the latter, unaware of what awaited me that night. I didn't think much of it when I saw the beam of light cast down by a lone, almost out-of-place streetlight. Must have been put there for safety reasons, I thought, and almost walked past, but I couldn't ignore what it illuminated. A branching path I had never seen, smooth, clean, as if it had just been freshly tarred that morning. I could see that it snaked through a previously inaccessible part of the forest, and that light poles lined it as far as I could see. I didn't feel dread walking the path, no sense of wrongness, not even apprehension. I had no reason to fear the path yet. I was halfway down its long winding procession when, on habit, I checked behind me to see if I was being stalked or followed. I didn't realize until then the stillness of the forest. It was dead silent now. No wind, no falling leaves, and no animal life. It had never been like this before, and though I had no reason to feel unease, I felt as if something was wrong. Not wanting to pussy out, I continued my walk, but I made sure to cast a glance behind me every few minutes. This felt important. like I had some prescience warning me of danger to come. The path looped around a bend of the forest I had never seen before, but I had expected to hit the foot of the hill since this cut straight into it. Instead, it wound around flatlands until I came to a stop at the mouth of the hidden valley, and before me, behind a gate and stone walls, was the suburb. There was no guard at the iron-barred gate entrance, and looking in, the place seemed abandoned. Streetlights were on, along with some porch lights in sparse intervals, but there were no signs of life. No cars, no yard ornaments, nothing but streets and houses. I pressed myself against the fence, peering in. I figured that either no one had moved in yet or it was well and truly abandoned. It wasn't unheard of. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, hundreds of half-built projects and buildings were left littered around the US. I figured it was one of those instances. Even if there was a logical reason for this place to exist, it still felt wrong. Like it didn't belong, couldn't belong. Cautiously, I slipped a hand through and reeled back as if burned. The night air was brisk and cool, intercut with an occasional breeze. But inside the suburb, stagnant is all I could attribute to it. Not quite muggy, but there was a stillness to the space before me I couldn't comprehend. I planted a foot through the gates. I expected something, anything. But the world beyond was still, unchanging, and I couldn't bring myself to make the climb over the gate. I stepped back, turned around, and started the walk back home. I threw a glance behind me every once in a while, watching the hidden suburb fade away, adrift in darkness until it was gone from sight. I had never felt so empty than on that walk back. I'd suffered a lot, lost even more, but nothing could compare to what I felt at that moment, as if I had reached an end stage of grief but never achieved catharsis. I spent the following weeks actively avoiding the hidden suburb. My jogs always ended before that trail split, and I refused to summit the overlooking hill. But nothing could keep it out of my thoughts. It wasn't so much that it beckoned to me. Nothing about its strange, lifeless streets could be romanticized. But there was longing. I realized that I longed for the promise of experience. Deep down, I knew the suburb was something that didn't belong and was known only to me. From my bedroom window, looking at the landscape beyond, I thought I could see the faint glimmer of the suburb. And when I closed my eyes, I dreamed of those uncanny streets and houses, of that alien, inhospitable stillness. In these dreams, I was a formless, disembodied thing, like a colorless mist. I'd snake between flickering streetlights and weave through narrow yards almost always at night, almost always Stygian, all moonlight sapped away by murky storm clouds. I was following someone. I knew this was my intrinsic guiding force. I'd catch glimpses of them, always in my periphery. No matter how much I tried to reach them, they always slipped away in this maze of houses and yards. Only once did I come close to bridging the distance between us. They had bolted down a side street through a stretch of pine-lined homes. I ran after them too, no voice to call out, but certain I'd reach them. Time slowed to dream-induced molasses crawl, and all the streets flickered for a moment and cut out, plunging us into true darkness. In the moments before, my target was mid-stride in front of a house with a red door. I remember this because all the houses up to this point had doors that were gray or occasionally green. But never this glossy, bright crimson red. Something about it made me recoil away in fear. As the lights cut, I heard the rattle of its doorknob, then darkness. A booming resonated throughout the suburbs as the door flew open and slammed back shut in a fraction of a second. I swore I heard the beginning of a scream, one born out of sheer horror. But it died before ever fully forming, and the lights came back on, greeting me with emptiness. They were gone, and I never saw them again. Sometimes in these dreams, the clouds parted, and an anemic beam of moonlight cut a thin sliver of pale light through the horizon. Against it, thrice I saw a man suspended in midair. Too dark to make any detail, all I saw was his silhouette, simply walking across the sky. The fourth and final time I saw him was in one of the rare instances these dreams took place in the daytime. It was hot. the sun unforgiving, and I was resting underneath the shade of a willow in the yard of a blue-doored house. A shadow caught my attention, looking up to see what was casting it. I saw him, descending from the sky, closer to earth than heaven, in a suit. One hand held a red balloon on a string, giving the ridiculous notion that it was his source of flight. Crudely scribbled on it in permanent marker was a crooked, smiley face. In his other hand, he had a briefcase, and his face was obscured by the glare of the sun. Even then, I doubted it could be human, or that he would even have a face at all. Fear snapped me out of the trance he held me under as he came within 30 or so feet from landing, and in a panic I fled inside. I don't know why I never thought to go inside a house before. Natural instinct or unconscious aversion. It was all overridden by the horror of that thing that waltzed across the sky. I barely got a look at the interior. The floor fell away beneath my feet and I fell into some strange amalgamated tunnel, a place of cobbled corridors and hallways, of raised walkways intercut with countless doors of all types. It's as if someone had taken the interiors and transitory spaces of countless buildings and merged them together, and, in one final act of madness, punched a hole through them and dropped me into its midst. It was never ending. I fell until I jolted awake, and once again I scrambled to my window, looking for that faint glow, and the crushing emptiness of its absence brought me to a new realization. For years I had struggled to make something different, something that would set me apart. But everything I had created failed to have that authenticity that came with experience. I was only creating fabrications, telling lies, and telling them poorly. The hidden suburb held promise, possibility, a chance at stumbling into something else. I was obsessed with the hope that this place would be the inspiration I needed. That following morning, I all but sprinted to that trail split. I almost lost my balance and fell head over heels at the sight of its absence. For a moment, I thought the underbrush must have grown over it and hidden it. But that should be impossible for a freshly paved road, especially in a matter of weeks. I tried wading through the dense weeds for a bit, but they led nowhere and gave away nothing. I turned around and sprinted back to the trailhead and summited the hillside. My lungs burned by the time I reached its peak, and was almost afraid to look to the valley beyond and confirm it was gone. Still, I forced myself to look, and I felt sick to my stomach. Nothing but the forest cover, nothing out of place or disturbed, as it had never even been there. I fell into a depressive state after that, sulked home, and in the following days tried to cope by telling myself that I had found a unique experience known only to me. Even if I never fully explored this fleeting place, I swore I'd try to wring something out of it. Most of all, I focused on the bafflement of what it was, why it appeared, and why it left. I had scrambled thoughts of some temporal spatial anomaly, and I refused to call it a hallucination or trick of the mind. I have too much self-respect for that. I know what I saw. Now, though, I don't know what to call it other than some layer of hell, something that should have never existed. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Back then, I was still sketching the contours and shapes of that forbidden place, never quite able to recreate its uncanny nature. And as fall gave way to winter and the nights became frigid, I stopped going on my night walks as often. It took one frustration-driven outburst at my parents after they asked me if I planned to go back to school to drive me up that hill. The suburb wasn't on my mind at first. I wanted space, fresh air, somewhere to smoke and gaze at the stars. I can't say I didn't hold my breath as I reached the top, and I couldn't help the despair I felt at being met with that forest canopy again. I lit another cigarette, barely smoking it as I stared blankly at the valley. When my cigarette finally burned out, I let out a pained sigh and turned to leave. I might have missed it if I hadn't taken the time to throw one last forlorn look at the valley. My heart sputtered as the warm glow met my eyes. Before I could fully register its reappearance, I was sprinting down the hill, toward the trail. These days, if I could change one thing, it would be that final glance, a single condemning act that would change me forever. When I came to the trail split, I swore I was on the verge of tears. It was there, guiding lights illuminating the road to another world. I let myself catch my breath and slowed to walk. I'd savor this, absorb every moment so that I might relay it meaningfully in some grand precursor to my magnum opus. My enthusiasm waned as I reached that gate. I was flushed anew with apprehension. Before I could talk myself out of it, I climbed and leapt the fence, feet hitting the ground and letting me know this was real. The first steps were cautious, expecting something to go wrong. But as I came to the first street sign, my gait relaxed and steadied. I threw a glance behind me at the entrance gate, unaware that would be the last time I'd see it. The first thing I did was walk up to a random house, painted a kitsch periwinkle, and pressed my face to a window. I only saw darkness through the window slits, and I almost knocked at the door but froze and shuddered, remembering my dream. The door was white and looked almost freshly painted, and yet I couldn't bring myself to knock. I had a feeling the door colors meant something, but I couldn't say what exactly. I walked away and rounded a corner to a greater stretch of house-lined roads. Street lights intermittently pockmarked the sidewalks, and other than a few porch lights, it was eerily dark. I avoided them, thinking that I'd be shielded from sight if I stayed out of the light. A side street leading to a cul-de-sac caught my attention, and I wound around it, coming to a stop at the first sign of human life. A statue of a kid, but in the most unnerving iteration possible. It was made of pipes, concrete, and rebar, twisted into the rudimentary form of a small human. The limbs were made of spindly rusted metal, the body a cylindrical casting of concrete, and a flat disc as the head. Adorned atop it, spiral metal shavings acting as hair. The worst was the face, crudely painted on, and without any details. I realized it was the same style as the one painted on the red balloon from my dreams. I shuddered, and then laughed with a giddy shrillness. Why it was made was almost as tantalizing a mystery as to who made it. This is what I had been looking for. This could be something that would define me and my art. I was right about one of those things. Walking back to the street entrance, I made sure to note the street name, Marion Court. I got ahead of myself and planned to return with a camera so I could document everything. And most of all, have proof that this place exists. I don't know when it happened. I should have paid more attention to the landscape, the streets and houses, and most of all the street signs. Maybe it's quantic in nature, only defined when directly observed, and when you look away it reverts to chaos, shifting and jumbling about until you look again and see that its form has changed. I didn't recognize the streets before me. The houses were a simulacrum of what I had just perused through, but they were undeniably different. My panic grew with every turned street corner that was foreign to me. I was kicking myself for having been so stupid, scolding myself for not having paid closer attention to my route, and then dawning with hysteria, screaming at myself for thinking this anomaly would ever act in accordance with natural law. Its stillness was a lie. I had known this from the start when it shifted out of existence and reappeared out of thin air. I wasn't running yet. That would come later. I was stuck in that trying not to panic, hurried walk. The kind that was accompanied by bewildered sweeping glances, searching for anything that could dispel your distress. I found no comfort, and before I could break down entirely, I collapsed underneath a streetlight, trying to steady my heart and breathing. The suburbs radiated out from me, and no matter where I looked, there was no sign of an exit. I went catatonic, emptied my mind, and lost hours. The distinct sensation of being watched brought me back to clarity. My eyes darted around, trying to see from where, until eventually I looked up at the streetlight. Shit. Countless windows, shrubbery, and shaded tree groves, all angled so that one could gaze upon the literal spotlight I was under. I stood up, letting my nerves come alive, and taking one last look around the suburb before I bolted, headed to the furthest, darkest corner. I prioritized taking the streets with the most turns and intersections, diving deeper into this tangled suburban labyrinth, hoping I'd lose whatever had taken interest in me. Even after I no longer felt the presence and I slowed to a jog, I made sure to spend an extra half hour weaving through the streets, taking sudden detours, trying to get lost on purpose this time. I only stopped when I got the brilliant idea to cut through a side yard, planning to leap through wood fences and cross through backyards and wind up as far away from where I had started as possible. The very first fence was an impasse I couldn't overcome. The wood dug painfully into my palms as I hoisted myself up to look into the backyard, and my breath caught in my throat. It was empty except for a well, a stereotypical cobbled stone well. It even had a bucket and rope, just set in the dead center. But that's not why I had to stifle a yelp. No, it was the sound emanating from its depths, a series of clambering thuds that reverberated throughout the ground. I dropped down as quietly as I could, on hands and knees, trying to recede into some nearby shrubbery for cover. Something like a roar cut through the thundering of its climb, a distorted siren-esque sound, pitching and cutting and bouncing around wildly. For a brief moment, I swore that abrasive, unnatural whine was right behind me, and my hands shot up to clamp over my mouth. And the next instant it was distant, a street over. Crawl. I had to get away. I had to stay unseen. On hands and knees, stifling my breath, trying to keep my heart from exploding in my chest. Another roar, rattling my ears and bones. Clearer this time. It was about to emerge. As I grasped around in the near pitch dark, in an attempt to crawl into the greenery alongside what I thought was a wall, my hands found purchase on nothing, only empty space. Before I could reel back and steady myself, I was falling end over end down a dirt slope, its jagged edges cutting and bruising my flesh. The only reason I didn't scream was sheer shock, and it was my saving grace, as in that moment the monstrosity was born, emerging with a third and final scream. I lay agonized, but silent as I listened to the sounds of the thing's footsteps shaking the earth, and the groan and clamber of the fence giving way to its procession. I shut my eyes and curled into myself, praying it wouldn't come my way. Even as its footsteps grew distant, I didn't dare let out a breath of relief. It was only until long after the thumps faded that I opened my eyes and saw the canopy of trees and the glimmer of stars as the clouds had finally parted. I wept and slept underneath the cover of alien stars. The touch of dawn brought me back from dreamless slumber, and I became aware of how much my body ached and the growing pain of hunger. But all was supplanted by the sight around me. I had fallen into a valley between houses. Another thing just cut and dropped somewhere it could not exist. I scrambled up the valley slope and carefully emerged back into the suburbs. It had changed again, radically this time. The old cookie-cutter aesthetic morphed into larger, more expensive homes, the streets wider and the yards larger. Fields and hills dotted the landscape, and even the seasons had changed. The air was warm, and the plant life in the overlooking hills had dried to cascading golden waves, shifting with every breeze. Most notable of all was the tallest overlooking hill, dotted with dozens of jagged pylons, morphed together as if malformed. Then and there I started to think of this place as if it was grown, not designed. There was no method or logic, just something that shouldn't be, couldn't be, forced into existing. Maybe it disappears when the world self-corrects, and then it's only a matter of time before it manifests again. A naturally occurring phenomenon, or willed by something I can't say. Whether I was lured here or stumbled in through sheer coincidence was another question that would never get an answer. I was here, and there was no foreseeable escape, and that's all that mattered now. I was thirsty, so I trudged around the nearest homes, noting the faded white doors and looking for a hose spigot. On my third try, I found one, nearly broke my hand forcing it open, and drank my fill. The daylight made me feel safer, and with newfound bravado, I went around door to door knocking, that off-white paint never changing and never getting a response. I still didn't have the courage to open the doors, though I was bold enough to test a door handle. Unlocked. Even then, I wasn't going to risk some other emerging monstrosity. Instead, I headed towards the nearest clearing, making sure I memorized the streets this time, even if I was convinced they'd shift again the second I took my eyes off them. I would have returned to the valley or scavenged for food, but I had to confirm something first. I glimpsed them in the distance, watched them for an hour or so, and saw that they remained unmoving. My stomach dropped as I crested the hill and came to the clearing where they stood. I counted them twice just to confirm what I was seeing. 36 statues of children, all the same style as the first one I had found the night before. All the same crudely painted faces. They ran the gauntlet of variation, and all were deeply unsettling. Spirals of cut sheet metal formed the locks on a little girl. She even had a crude pink bow adorning the top of her head. Another had curved rebar formed one boy's hand, and at the end of it someone had placed a baseball glove, now weathered by years of exposure, but it confirmed a suspicion that had arisen in me. This iteration of the hidden suburb had once been inhabited. I walked through the field of children to the center where an ancient basket lay. Most of the offerings had rotted or dried away a long time ago, but a single jar of jam and rock-hard biscuits remained. I ended up tossing the biscuits, after nearly breaking my teeth on them, but the jar opened up easily enough with some elbow grease. I sniffed it, didn't detect any rot, and dipped a finger in and tasted it. Apricot, cloyingly sweet but better than nothing. I ate a third of it on my trek back and washed it down with more spigot water. To my surprise, the streets remained static this time, and I was able to navigate my way back to the valley entrance. But instead, I chose to sit in the neighboring house's yard and watch the sun recede. I cried again as sunset dawned. By dusk, I was back in that valley, tucked away in a corner, hoping to remain unseen. I had ripped the cloth off an awning to use a blanket, but it did little against the night chill. And that night, I found no sleep. Only in daylight was I able to drift off for a few hours and awake once more in the late afternoon. It went on like this for days, then weeks. I ate through the jam jar too quickly, and hunger set in again. Worse this time, I regretted not saving the biscuits. Maybe I could have softened them with some water. At one point, I went around hunting for mushrooms, choosing to risk it rather than starve to death. But other than the trees and grasses, there's no life here. Not anymore. Whatever happened to this place drove all other living beings out, or worse. The only reason I didn't starve to death was sheer luck. I stumbled upon a single walnut tree in a side yard on a stretch of houses bordering a hillside. It had dropped all its fruits, and the husks had rotted and dried up long ago. Smashing them against a back wall was enough to get to the meat inside, and I subsisted off that and spigot water alone. Still, I was haggard and growing emaciated with every passing day, but I didn't dare stray too far from this section of calm. I went as far as the pylon-dotted hill to survey the surrounding landscape, and other than hills to one side, the only other thing worth noting was yet another walled radial suburb in the underlying flatlands. I couldn't work up the nerve to make the trek there, for now I was safe here, and I still held the hope that this place would shift back to its original configuration, and I'd find that gate and make my way home. Foolish. One day, as the sun started to dip below the horizon, he appeared without warning. Resting beneath the shade of a willow, I almost missed him against the glare of the sunset. Drifting across the sky, no detail could be made out from this distance, but it was impossible to mistake him for anything else than the suited man with the red balloon. I scrambled to recede from sight, crawling from bush to bush. Slowly, so that he wouldn't be as likely to see my movement, I inched closer to the forested valley. I never took my eyes off him as he was headed toward my direction, and I prayed it was a mere coincidence. I finally reached the lip of the valley and started to slink beneath it as the first shadows of dusk crept across the land. He was nearing the valley but was not descending. His sheer elevation gave me confidence. The balloon he held was a tiny red pinprick. I nestled myself between a grove of dense trees, never taking my eyes off him. He came to rest near the center of the valley and was several times higher than the half-set sun. I don't know how he did it, but the already waning light wicked away and pulled the world into darkness in a matter of seconds. As if he snuffed it out, or absorbed it. The rays of light contorted and coalesced around him, darkening to a monochrome anti-light as it neared him, and tainting to an oily black that spread out across the sky like cancer and bathing the world in a true void dark. There were no stars or moon that night, and all I could do was huddle against a tree I couldn't even see and sleep. I awoke to a new suburb. I crawled out cautiously, fearful that the suited man I now called Sun Eater was still around. Guided only by the faint glow of a distant streetlight, I made sure to never step out of the cover the shade brought. It was similar to the first iteration the hidden suburb had taken, but significantly more dilapidated. Several roofs were missing shingles, the sidewalks were worn and cracked, potholes pockmarked the roads, and everything was overgrown and ugly. Yard grasses reaching knee-length and trees gnarled and twisted into themselves. This realm was one of eternal night, with no way to tell how many days passed. I can't say how long I was stuck here. Only my hunger and deteriorating sleeping schedule gave a hint at the time that passed, but it was hardly accurate. Eventually, thirst drove me to seek resources, but even then I couldn't bring myself to enter one of the homes. No matter how many times I tried rationalizing it, I'd rather starve. Eventually, I did find a spigot to drink out of after palming around the exteriors of houses. It groaned far too loud for comfort, and I was only able to get a few gulps of water before I shut it off out of fear. I retreated to the quadrant that contained the valley entrance, but it was too late. I had brought unwanted attention upon myself. My heart thrummed at an all too familiar presence. The thing that had noticed me that first night, beneath a streetlight, had set its sights on me once more. I tried snaking around a street corner, clinging low and close to shrubbery, but I caught a glimpse of it from my periphery, it too prowling near a dim porch-lit yard. It was like a shadow come to life, and for the briefest moment, we locked eyes. It was blurry against the stark night, but it was unmistakably humanoid. We both took off running simultaneously, neither no longer caring about avoiding the lights. The only focus was trying to outpace each other. I tried repeating that same strategy from the first night, taking wild, abrupt turns down random streets, pivoting and weaving through yards and looping around houses, trying to lose it. But it was always in my periphery, always in some corner, just barely keeping up with me. Maybe it was because I had grown weaker in my malnourishment, or maybe it had learned from our previous encounter. Either way, I couldn't lose it. My body screamed in agony and my lungs burned, but I refused to relent to them and refused to let this thing catch up to me. All I heard was the rushing of wind and an occasional garbled cry emitted by that thing. Its speech was wrong, as if underwater and heavily filtered and modified. I thought I could catch fragments of words, things like wait and stop. Diving through a side yard, I nearly doubled over, and it came closer than ever, seeing that it was like a living glitch, its dark form vibrating and twitching into random positions every second that passed, but I didn't slow down enough for me to glimpse more. No, I recovered and began to sprint down an adjacent sidewalk. The thing stayed behind, letting out a final string of words, finally getting me to slow as I understood 4 of its words.
Please, don't. Keep running.
I watched it recede into the darkness and disappear altogether. Something about its voice stuck out to me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I was heaving to catch my breath as I started parsing through all the possibilities, arriving at a conclusion as a new heart-seizing sound cut through the night, the rattle of a turning doorknob. I craned my head towards the sound and nearly pissed myself at the sight. Illuminated by the dull porch light, slick and shiny like freshly spilled blood, was a red door. The sound of its old hinges screeching were a starting gun, sending me fleeing away from it. The porch light dying out the second the door opened. No weaving, no cutting corners. No, this thing was all-consuming. There was no hiding from it. Its footfalls were nothing like the lumbering beast that emerged from the well. It made no sound. Instead, any light that crossed its path overloaded and burst, plunging the ill-lit night into deeper darkness, into its grasp. A high-pitched whirring whine rose to a fever pitch, before another streetlight exploded in a brief shower of sparks that nipped at my ankles. The encroaching darkness was moments away from collapsing upon me, but I wouldn't yield without a desperate attempt to live for a few moments longer. Another streetlight burst. This time for a moment I felt the sparks graze the skin of my arm, but I was still a hair's distance between me and that horror. I realized that I had been trying to warn myself of this place the entire time, through an echo of my dream self transcending time and space. The presence that had stalked me spoke with what was undeniably my voice. I had seen myself die in some future to this exact monstrosity, had seen the danger of the Sun Eater. Even then I failed to heed its warning. Still a manifestation of that fragmented self, that echo had tried against all odds to save me. In the end, there was still one last thing it had shown me. The street before me was coming to a T-shaped intersection, and this thing was sweeping across the suburb like a calamity, purging it of light. I couldn't turn left or right, that would be my doom, and to continue to run straight ahead would be death, except for one final Hail Mary. The intersection was lined with houses, one directly in my path. Tendrils of inky dark mist arched around me. I saw them in my periphery, moments away from ensnaring me and dragging me to some horrific end, something far worse than death. My legs started to give out, my chest burning in an inferno of pain. I made a leap of faith, using the last of my strength to fling myself against the pale blue door of the house. In the end, I was swallowed by darkness as I fell into those depths, escaping by an infinitesimal fraction of a second. I didn't fall through that strange amalgamated landscape from my dream. No, it was more like jolting away from a dying nightmare, waking in the moment of death. But this was real. In an instant, I collapsed onto hard concrete, body aching and tears streaming at the sounds of bird calls. I had escaped the hidden suburb, 26 miles in 2 days. That's how far I was from home and how long I had been missing, and somehow I ended up in an abandoned mall parking lot. I told the cops what happened, and of course they trotted out the same old bullshit, the excuses of delirium, a bad trip, and momentary psychosis, though they couldn't explain the weight loss. I didn't care. I lived, and that's all that mattered. I don't do art anymore. The same day of my escape, I swore I'd never pick up a sketchpad again. I spent the last decade and a half a recluse. I still live with my parents, and though I know they think I'm a fuck-up, I'm grateful to at least be alive. Yes, there are countless theories I've come up with in the preceding years. The different rules for different iterations of the suburbs. The purpose of the Sun Eater. Who were the second iteration's inhabitants and what happened to them? Who made the child statues and what do the doors' colors mean? How does an echo come to be? I won't share any of them. I don't think it does me any good to discuss this subject further. I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no. Yes, I still live in the same place, but the hidden suburb has never appeared since. Nor have I seen its glow from my window, nor the trailhead. Not even when cresting the hill that overlooks that valley. It doesn't beckon to me. I don't search for it. I don't plan to ever return. I have a feeling the hidden suburb is infinite, just lurking beneath the surface and can appear anywhere to anyone. But that's not why I'm writing this, as I've said from the start. The therapist told me I had to get this out, but I do want to talk about the incident that triggered my visit to the therapist. 2 weeks ago, as I was taking a midday smoke break outside, I saw it drifting along the breeze. A red balloon with a crudely drawn smiley face. If that blue door was an exit, I can say for certain I didn't shut it on my way out. Stay safe out there, guys. Hello there. Thank you for watching. This story was a bit more slow burning and mysterious. Please let me know if you would like to hear more stories like this one. If you want a similar story, check the one on screen. Lastly, if you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay creepy and see you in the next story.